Welcome to Game Changers Podcast. This is the second of two podcasts on the topic of women innovators. I'm Mark Ranella, Senior Editor at the IXL Center. A couple of weeks ago, we had an engaging conversation with Audrey Cheng from Genentech, based in San Francisco. As Senior Manager of Operations at Genentech, Alice had a lot of great insights to share about getting innovation done in a large and complex organization. This week, we're turning our attention to a more entrepreneurial setting, one might call it social entrepreneurship, all the way to Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. This is where we find today's guest, Audrey Cheng, who grew up in Maryland and attended Northwestern University in Chicago. She's been a venture capitalist, computer programmer, and is an intrepid world traveler. She's been featured in NBC News and made Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 list in 2016 for her founding of the Moringa School in Nairobi. So the Moringa School is an innovative computer programming school that aims to get young Kenyans employed in the country's growing tech sector. Before founding the Moringa School, Audrey worked for Savannah Fund, which is a seed capital fund that specializes in investments in early-stage high-growth technology startups in sub-Saharan Africa. She did all this by the age of 22. Pretty remarkable. I talked to Audrey from Boston while she was several time zones away in Nairobi. Tell me about your move from the United States to Africa. That was such a huge change for you, right? Going from Maryland to Nairobi. How was the transition for you?
Yeah, I was in Chicago right before Nairobi.
Okay.
So yeah, it was a very kind of smooth transition, to be honest. Like I'm not a person that like overthinks like life changes, and so when I moved, I was just like, okay, like I'm in this new place, and how do I learn as much as I can?
Wow, it sounds like you're really adaptable. So I'd like to ask you a few questions about your background, especially what your aspirations may have been when you were younger and how those may have related to your work in education now.
Sure, yeah. So I was born in Maryland and then spent most of my childhood born in Ohio, spent most of my childhood in Maryland. Growing up in Maryland, I always sort of had the sense, even going through elementary school, middle school, high school, like that there was something bigger that I was going to do. And so just like inside, I always felt like, look, like, I'm spending all my days going to this institution called school, but never really felt like I was getting the value or the experience that I wanted, right? So as I was going through like different levels of education, I ended up getting into Northwestern for university. And so when I went to Northwestern, I was again, I expected this like really grand exciting place where like knowledge is constantly being exchanged, people are curious, and there's just like this incredible creative energy. But really quickly, I realized when I was at Northwestern that there was such a work hard, play hard culture that's very prevalent across many campuses. And like I went to classes and lecture halls were like huge, and there were so many students, and they oftentimes like either weren't engaged or they like didn't come to class. Always checking like Twitter, Facebook, whatever during class, and I was really demoralized, to be honest, like going into university, and realized very quickly that education and like what I actually needed to learn was outside of campus. And so essentially
demoralized.
Yeah. Yeah, it was super demoralized. I expected so much more. I think I had this like very idealistic idea of like talking about like the meaning of life every day, and all these other kind of big philosophical questions. Like that just didn't happen on campus. So yeah, so I like kind of looked elsewhere for it.
Reminds me of my own background. I went to University of Florida for a semester, but I mainly went to Amherst College. And Amherst College,
Okay.
I felt like that we were talking about the meaning of life a lot of times.
Oh, nice. That's amazing. Yeah, maybe I just went to the wrong school. Yeah.
So unfortunately, it seems like university wasn't a very inspiring place for you. So I wonder then, when did your interest in innovation really get started?
I think it goes back to your question around my childhood. I think growing up, I always thought that there were like better ways of doing things, right? So I was constantly thinking of, okay, well, even things as simple as like doing chores, right? Like I would think about, okay, like I'm washing these dishes, like how can I do it in a way that's more effective, or how do I think about like the like what I'm doing, and and then I know this sounds silly, but like like essentially going to first principles, right? So thinking about like what is the purpose of what I'm doing, like what is like X made out of, and like how do we kind of reshape it, right?
Mm.
And I think one of my favorite videos I've ever seen was just, and this is very classic, but this video about Steve Jobs, where he essentially was talking about, everything that we see in this world, it was built by humans, right? So like there's so much like around like buildings, and if we look at cars, if we look at anything, right? It like they were constructed like from the human mind, which means that we can deconstruct it and then reconstruct it. And I thought that was just like super super fascinating of just like rethinking everything that's around us. And yeah, so I mean, it's just kind of been part of like my yeah, I guess like my nature since I
Right.
was
So
younger.
you've been a critical thinker for ever since you started out, and I think something similar is like when you think about history. History shows you the
Hmm.
human origins of things we take for granted. You know, which is
Yeah.
I'm a history buff, and I find it
Nice.
shows sort of insights like, oh, we don't have to do it this way. We could change the way we approach this certain problem. So
Yeah, yeah, and most problems have already been, like played with in the past, and so how do we learn from people who've done it before? So yeah, it just takes extra work.
right, right. Well, but it saves work in the long term. That's for sure.
Sure,
Um,
exactly,
so,
definitely.
do you have a maybe a best innovation story? Something you like to tell people, some interesting example of innovation that you like to point to? Something you've done that you're really proud of?
I think saying Moringa School is kind of stating the obvious, but before Moringa School, I helped start Northwestern's first like entrepreneurship club, because I kind of saw like a huge need for this kind of programming, because like at that time on campus there was very little programming for actual startups and like thinking about like creation and building. And so during that time, I spent a lot of time in Chicago, and went to 1871, went to a lot of other spaces to learn about like what is this like whole startup and innovation craze.
Hmm.
And then like spent a lot of time thinking about how do we bring this to Northwestern. So yeah, so I mean, I think it's something that I've thought a lot about like since I was younger. Like when I was in high school, also started like a club that we called like Angels Network, and spent a lot of time thinking about like how do we creatively like raise money and do it in a way that is exciting for both like the person giving us money, but also for like the cause that we're raising money for. And so just again like spent a lot of time thinking through problems outside of classwork.
Right, right. So I'm wondering too, have you had either, some really good advice that people have given you as you were growing up, or a hero or a mentor that was particularly important?
Yeah, I think my my manager or my boss at Savannah Funds, he was very very um, I guess like opinionated on entrepreneurs staying focused. And I think that that's one of like the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten is, there's so many entrepreneurs that like they're too opportunistic and they're constantly looking at other things and distracting like the focus of where they're heading. And so he was always like, look, like you need to stay focused, right? The people who stay focused are ultimately the people who succeed. And I think like that's been really incredible advice I've carried on to like everything we do at Moringa is, every time we think of like a new idea or a new service or offering or way of growing, we always ask ourselves, look, is this actually aligned with like where we're heading? Is it going to take too many resources from us? Like, is it worth the resources, like the trade-offs, etc.
Hmm.
I think that's been really, really helpful for us to think through as we make decisions here.
So you've already been a practicing innovator in a lot of different venues. And I'm wondering from your experience, have you noticed if women bring something special or particular to innovation efforts or to projects that require innovation?
So yeah, no, I think women offer a ton. I think that the way that we look at the world is different, right, than the way that men look at the world. So I guess as an example, our students at Moringa School, the women essentially encouraged and motivated to join Moringa School because they see learning how to code as a tool to solve some of the world's like biggest problems, right? So that's kind of the way they look at it. Versus a lot of our male students are also really excited to learn how to code, but the way they see it is, oh, like, this is a skill that I can play with, and they're really excited about the actual like coding component of it. So I think when women kind of like, when women come, like they think more of like the potentially the macro impacts of everything they do. And so I think women are also very like empathetic, and that plays a huge role in innovation and also how we build for customers. So yeah.
Right, absolutely. And can you elaborate on that empathy?
Yeah, so I mean, I either from like my own experience or just from other like female entrepreneurs that I'm friends with, I think that this kind of empathy, right, of really like thinking about, okay, our customer comes first, right? But not just in the sense of, oh, our customer comes first because they give us money, right? But really thinking about, okay, like how do we make their experience very fulfilling, really really impactful, right? And give them everything they actually need to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
So even at Moringa School, we in our course we think a lot about not just the technical skills, but also soft skills, like lifelong learning skills and other things that we know that we don't have to give the students, but we give it to them because we want them to be successful post Moringa, right? No matter which career they choose. And so I think, again, like, there's a lot of empathy. There's also a lot of humility. And so like, like owning up to the fact that we don't know most things, right? And I think as humans, it's really easy for leaders to feel like, oh, I have to know everything and I have to have an answer. But I think women, especially, I found like when they don't know things, like they're faster to own up to like, yeah, like actually I have no idea, and like let's try to figure this out. As opposed to saying, look, I know everything, and let me tell you how we should do this.
Right. I talked to a guy who used to work at McKinsey for years, and he had a axe to grind about how CEOs often had this sort of posture of infallibility and were very worried about being fallible, and which totally stifled communication because nobody could go up to them and say, "Oh, I made a mistake, boss. We need to change plans or something like that." So
Mm-hmm.
that's a
Which is
really
super
interesting.
healthy and normal.
Right, making a few mistakes should not be a big deal. It's hiding mistakes that becomes a problem. So, looking towards the future, do you have any big plans in mind, either for the Moringa School or maybe for other projects that you're thinking about?
This is definitely not my my short-term goal. I think this is my like very long-term goal. I definitely am like very committed to staying with Moringa for a long time, just to make sure we really hit scale, like we're strong, we continue to grow, and we continue to impact more lives.
Hmm.
I think in like the very long term, like let's say even like in 20 years, I've had this idea for a long time around building like a research and media arm, right? So like using more crowd-funded research so that the public is more tied into research as opposed to research being a purely academic kind of discipline, and then using the media outlet to essentially help to like I guess like not dilute, but to help explain the findings from the research. It's something I'm like really interested in light of all this like fake news that's happening.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I think just like in like the very long term, like thinking about other ways to kind of like build more truth in our society.
So I'm curious, could you like think of an example of this in action, say in the future? If this is working, somebody needs this service, how do they, what are they getting exactly?
Yeah, so the general public would put money into the service.
Hmm.
So like just think of like Kickstarter, right? Like people like put money into like new products or new ideas, etc.
Hmm.
And it's similar for this platform where like people would want to like know the truth and find the truth about like a certain question,
Mm.
right? And then afterwards, like once it's funded, and I'm sure like we need to get like larger donors involved because research is just really expensive. Like maybe donors or other people will choose to like fund as much as the public funds so that there's
Hmm.
some sort of balance there.
Right.
And then afterwards we'll be able to like have a very ethical and I guess like disciplined study around this kind of question that like all these like researchers who are like well trained and and like very kind of bright researchers kind of go through a scientific study to understand like this question, and then you and then through the media arm be able to share the study results.
Mm. So the idea here is to make it easy for the public to access in-depth, detailed information about problems that concern them at any point in time.
Exactly. Yeah. Again, this is just like a very rudimentary idea right now. It's not something that I'll work on for the next like 20 years, but I think it's something that I'm like just very curious about. So yeah.
So that's the end of the first half of our conversation with Audrey. We'll pick up with her again when we focus on innovation in education. And thinking about the conversation we had, I was really struck by her emphasis on success. Obviously, she has a great curiosity, lots of experience, lots of ability, but in her own life and in the classes she's teaching at the Moringa School, she really focuses on how to get things done. So that leads us back to teaching her students soft skills in addition to hard skills, because soft skills help them succeed in business context, and also her mentor's advice to focus her efforts if she wants to succeed. That curiosity is certainly a great asset to have, but it's not enough to get things done. I think that harkens back to some of the ideas of the IXL Center in its focus on not only ideation, but also execution. Not only on creating the ideas behind a new service or product, but also how to actually capture value from them. And I think that whole picture of inspiration, but also execution, is key in successful innovation practices long term. Come visit us next month when we'll have a podcast on innovation in the oil industry. So until then, this is Mark Ranella, Senior Editor for the IXL Center, wishing you all the best. Take care.